Hey, Nathan here. Welcome back to another C++ video. You remember in the very first few episodes, I told you to not worry about what this means and what this means whenever we are working in the code. Well, we are going to discuss that today when we talk about functions. Now, what is a function? A function is a way to have a set of logic. In this case, we have a main function here, and all of our previous tutorials, we had a set of logic we performed inside a function, inside this main function here. And that function can be called. In this case, the main function is called by Windows. Whenever we start the program, it has a program entry point, and that is the main function. So the main function is called whenever we start the program. So a function is something that can be called that performs a set of logic. You know, it can be anything inside that code. A function can also call another function, that can also call another function, that can call 10 other functions in it. So a single function can have all sorts of logic in it, and all that logic is wrapped in a function that can be called. So why would you have functions? Well, in the case where we're talking about video games, we have a player object, and where we want to, we have an enemy. When the enemy hits the player, we want to damage the player. So yeah, we can say player health minus enemy damage. But it's better to wrap that logic in a function to where we say we call the damage function and we give it the amount to damage the player. Or if we have a standard way of, let's say we have a greeting. We give a name and it provides a standard greeting. We don't want the greeting to change from player A or player B. We want it to be a standard greeting. So let's say we pass in Nathan. The standard greeting will be, "Hello, Nathan," or "Greetings, Nathan." We want it to be standard no matter what name we pass in there. So in that case, we would wrap that logic. We give it the name, we wrap that logic in where it wraps it up and says, "Hello, name." So we have a standard way of doing things. Or let's say we have a method that we want, or a function. Method is another name for function in other programming languages. If you're talking about Java or C#, I'm a very heavy C# user. So there might be some times where I say method on accident because it's what we refer to in the C# programming environment. Okay, so let's get started, and for this example, let's just say we have an add. So we will duplicate our main, add. Alright, so that's duplicated our main function. We have an int add return 0. However, when we add something, what do we usually need? We need two values, right? When we add 1 plus 2, we need the two values 1 and 2. So in this case, we need to pass things to a function. And that inside the parentheses, we can put parameters. And the types of the parameters are going to be integers in this case. So int x, comma, int y. We can have a lot of parameters. You just separate them by commas. Now, these are parameters. X and Y are now parameters. Now, what does add need to return? Well, we give it two values. Add should pretty much return the addition of those two values. So return x plus y. So this integer, where we have int add, this integer right before the word add, that is the return type. We cannot return something that is a different type than the return type. So I'm trying something really stupid here to demonstrate. This addition returns an integer. However, I'm trying to return a string value here, which we discussed in the last tutorial, strings. And if you see the error, it says return value type does not match the function type. So you have to either return the same value. Alright, so I put it back to the way it's supposed to be, to return x plus y. Now, you can do this, you can certainly do this, return and then use logic here, x plus y. We can actually add those as we return it. We can have those in the return line. Or, if you prefer, result is equal to x plus y. And then we can return the result. So they both pretty much are the same thing. We're just returning x plus y in one line without having to store it in another integer. Okay, so that is a function. A function needs to have something before it to identify the return type. Now, if you do not want it to return anything, you use void for the return type. It will not return anything. So void display message. It's a good thing to keep things standardized. If you saw there, I had a capital D. I'm going to put a lowercase d in its place because I'm going to make things standardized. And what I mean by that, main, add, they are both lowercase. The M in main and the A in add are lowercase letters. The D in display message is going to be lowercase, and then any word after that I'm going to capitalize. So it's a good thing to keep things, the same in your program. You do not want to have a different type of capitalization structure in part of your program and a completely different set later on in your program. You want to keep things standardized. Alright, so display message, this does not return anything. It is void. So I can just put my logic here. I'll put cout hello world. I'm going to do end L here. Alright, so that just displays a message. This will actually add. Okay. Now, so we have these two functions ready to go. These two functions, how add and display message, how do we get to these lines here? How do we get that logic to perform? With the main function, we don't have to worry about it because that's automatically called when we start the program. But how do we get these to be called? Well, inside of your main function, you can start the list of, what to do. Like I mentioned in the very beginning of the video, you can have a function, call a function, call a function. So your main function is going to start that process off. Maybe you have a while loop, and you let your game do your thing, and your game calls a function. That calls another function. That calls another function. It keeps on going and going and going. But our main function is the main entry point of our program. So in this case, let's say display message. So this will call the function. We need to pass it a parentheses that identifies it as a function call. Parentheses and then semicolon. So if we press F5 here, I forgot my sin.get. Alright, so if we press F5 here, hello world. So called that function, it displayed hello world, and it's void, so it does not need to return anything. If it has anything else, it must have return and then something here. So display message. Alright, fine. So that's how you call that function. So now let's call add. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Function does not take 0 arguments. So you see add here needs to have an x and y. Those are called parameters. When you call the function, those are called arguments. 3, 4. So x becomes 3, y becomes 4. Now if we press F5, hello world, so it's fine. However, add returns an integer. So if we want to use that integer, int add result is equal to add 3, 4. All right. Now let's go ahead and see out add result. Hello world and 7. So it adds 3 and 4, which is 7, and then we store that in add result, and then we see out that add result. Now, what if we did this? Hello world and 7. So you can see out and call the function that way, or you can store it in a variable like we did before and see out that variable. You know, maybe you want to do some more things to that variable, or maybe you want to refer to it later on. So these are functions, and a function has a return type. Here is a basic structure of a function. Return type. You know, what you want it to return. If you do not want to return anything, it is void. You know, it can be int, bool, double, float, ... And void if nothing is returned. So that's a return type. Alright, so a function here is return type, then function name, opening parentheses, parameters, closing parentheses, opening, closing, curly brackets there, and logic here. Return line needs to be present if return type is not void. Alright, so that's the basic structure of a function. The very first thing we need to provide is the return type. And we'll get into more detailed ways of doing this later on. Just for now, for a beginner discussion, this is the basic structure for a function. So the very first thing we provide is a return type. You know, void, integer, boolean, double, float, a string. What it should return. And the name of the function, opening parentheses. And then we pass it the parameter, or give it the parameters it needs. In this case, int y. Int x, int y. You know, I can say int z, int w, int h, int j. You know, I can keep on going and going and going with this. So we start up with the parameters, and then we have an ending. We have a ending parentheses. Then we have opening curly bracket, and then we put in our logic here. And then we have to have a return, at least one return that's always called. A return line needs to be present if return type is not void. We have a void here. We do not have a line that says return inside this function. This is not void, so we must have a return inside this function. Now, what do I mean by at least one always has to be present, or at least one always has to be called. Well, let's just say... Alright, so I'm going to set up another function to demonstrate something really quick. We're going to return an integer, so our return type needs to be int. I'm going to call this hit player. This is going to be a video game example. So we hit the player, we need to give it the int damage, and then we need to have the player's absorption. So a player can absorb a certain amount of damage. So, for example, we'll also pass in the int current health. This will be much cleaner when we get to classes and things like that, but for now, just follow me with this example here. So we hit the player. So what needs to be provided when we hit the player? Well, player's health needs to be taken into account, so we need to give it the current health. Alright? The enemy's damage needs to be taken into account to determine how much the health should decrease, so we pass in the enemy's damage. And let's just say you're building a game where a player can have some magic properties to absorb a certain amount of damage. So in that case, we pass in the player's absorption rating. Okay, so let's just say if damage is less than absorption. Or, I'm sorry, greater than. If damage is greater than absorption, that's fine. So we provide more damage than what we can absorb. So what I'm going to do is current health. Now I can return this here. Current health. My current health is equal to current health minus opening parentheses. Now I'm going to group things together here. Current health minus damage minus absorption. So absorption does take some amount of the damage, but not everything. Semicolon. So current health is equal to current health minus the result from the absorption taking most of the damage. Okay, that's good. So, now if damage is less than absorption, we don't want current health to do anything, right? You know, absorption takes all of it. And maybe you're building a game where absorption does not wear out. Maybe it's a permanent thing. So in this case, current health and absorption are staying where they are. In that case, you might think that function is correct, right? So if we build it, and it certainly builds fine, but keep in mind here, C++ does not do things like other programming languages. Other programming languages will give you an error here. C++ will not. You might have weird results whatever you do with C++. This is one of the things I do not like about C++. Think about this here. If you pass in something where damage is less than absorption, there is no return here. So let's just see what that does. So I'm going to say int new health is equal to hit player. Alright, so I'm going to pass damage of 1, absorption of 10, and current health of 100. And I'm going to see out new health. New health becomes 1. Why is that? Well, as you see here, damage is less than absorption. It does not return anything. Our current health is 100. Absorption should be taking all of that, so we should have 100, right? So it's a good idea to have all your bases checked. So if damage is greater than absorption, we return the new health. Otherwise, let's just return our current health. And it would help if I provide the return there. Okay, so now we know 100% that we will return something. You know, if damage is less than absorption, we still return some value here. So we always need to return something. Other programming languages will complain to you, saying not all code types return a value. Alright, just for fun, this is C#. This is another programming language that's similar in many ways to C++. Do not worry about the static for right now. Just all I want to show you is what C# will do if you do not have that other thing that we added to C++. So in C++ we had else return current health. In C# we have not added that yet. And look what the error message is. Program.hitPlayer int, not all code paths return a value. So in other programming languages, you will get this error message. In C++, we did not. So C++ is forgiving in many ways to what you can do with that language. In other programming languages, you have to abide by the rules. You know, you must return something because you provided int. In this case, we do not return anything if damage is less than absorption. But C++ is forgiving in that aspect. So you want to be careful when you do that. You always want to make sure you're returning something. Otherwise, you might get something you do not want to happen. In this case, we do not want 1 to be the result. We want 100 to be the result. Alright, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. We covered a lot of things in this video. Functions are very useful. Obviously add, you don't need to have a function for that. It's basically A plus B type of thing. But hit player, you might not want to have this exact function, but in your video game, you want to have a function to damage the player. And you also want to do some checks, too. If damage is greater than 0, you don't want to damage with a negative value, otherwise you gain health. Or maybe you want that in your game, who knows? But the thing is, functions are very useful for lots of things you can do. You might have 10 different places where you want to hit the player, and you don't want to keep on doing the same logic 10 different times. You want to call a function that the function does all this logic in one place, that 10 other places call that function. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video. We discussed void. That does not need a return statement, a return line. Anything else needs to have a return. And we also discussed conditionals inside of the function, where you need to return something. C++ is forgiving if not all code paths return a value. But as we saw, C# is not so forgiving in that aspect, where it'll give us an error message saying not all code paths return a value. So keep that in mind when you're building functions. Make sure at least one return is called at all times. And otherwise you might get an undesirable result. Alright, so I hope to see you next time. I have my list here. Next thing we will discuss is file input-output. How to write to a file and how to read a file. And, might as well. The tutorial after that will be classes and header files. The tutorial after that will be arrays. And then we'll go into the fun stuff. So, I hope to see you next time.